What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to College Football Talk with Peter Burnett. You might have guessed from the jersey that I've got on. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking about Netflix's most recent docuseries, Untold Swamp Kings, which dives into the Florida Gators of the 2005 to 2010 when Urban Meyer was there. A team that got 2 national championships but dealt with a lot of off-the-field issues and even their on-the-field issues as well, losing some big games and missing out on maybe something that would have solidified their status as potentially the greatest team of all time. The 2009 graduating class was certainly up there, the incoming recruiting class of 06, among the best recruiting classes of all time. But if you go on to enjoy this video, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more college football talk like this. Without further ado, let's dive into it. The most electrifying environments, the most passionate fan bases, the traditions we hold dear, tailgates we wake up early for, the memories we make, the rivals we hate, and the losses we try to forget. This is college football. Swamp Kings, the way it starts out is with the episode 1 titled Go Big or Go Home, or Go Hard or Go Home, I think is what it was called. And what it really focuses on is how Urban Meyer brought in a culture of just this intensity in the weight room and then translating that onto the field. It looks at the 2005 season in pretty good depth, kind of shedding light on what that foundational time period looked like as Urban Meyer was trying to establish that culture in the program, and definitely dealt with some challenges in that, some players, it was easy to buy into it. You look at guys who came in the next class, Brandon Spikes and Tebow. I think Seiler is another guy who also bought into it. And so Spikes, actually, now I think about it, he was one of the guys who didn't buy in so much to like the just going all out in the gym, but instead taking it onto the football field and there to play. But there was a lot around this team that surrounded it. And I think that's one first takeaway that I want to kind of give my thoughts on. I saw an article about this saying that if you go in expecting kind of a tabloidy type look at the Florida Gators of that time, you're not really going to get it. It's definitely a dive into the program. It touches on some of the issues that some of the players got into. It has a real brief mention of Aaron Hernandez when he got into a fight at a bar. Racial slurs were hollered at him, and Tim Tebow said he wished he would have done more in that situation. But overall, the director, actually, I think Catherine English is her name, she said that she didn't want to shed too much light on things that have already been kind of covered extensively in the press. And so that was part of the reason why things like, they didn't really focus on too much of the legal issues. That was something that they focused on, I think, a little bit in the 3rd episode, which I'll get to in a little bit. I'm going to go through this kind of episode by episode. So again, episode 1, they talk about setting the foundation, talked about the 05 season, and then started taking a little bit of a glance into the 06 season, because obviously there was some of that carryover in terms of setting the standard for Florida Gator football. The 2nd episode is titled A New Chapter, and that's where we really start getting a look at the 2006 recruiting class that came into Gainesville to play for the Florida Gators. Leading the way in that class was Tim Tebow, who later in the episode Urban Meyer referred to as the alpha dog on offense. And then you also have Brandon Spikes, who was the alpha dog on defense. More on those two and those alpha comparisons later in this video. But that period, they incorporate Tim Tebow into the offense. If you know college football, you know that 2006 season you had Chris Leak as kind of the QB1, and then you had Tim Tebow coming in as that kind of second weapon that could get the job done with his legs and just the physicality and everything, while Leak was more of a traditional pocket passer. In this, dive into, again, that recruiting class. There are a few others. I think Chris Rainey was one of the guys. One player also, and I saw this in another article, just kind of making sure that I had all my thoughts together for this video, was Percy Harvin, who was an absolutely electric receiver. If you watched college football during this time period in the late 2000s, mid to late 2000s, you know that he was absolutely electric. Another guy that I kind of didn't really realize was as electric as he was, but from looking at the plays that they highlighted and him being interviewed, was Brandon James. He had an electric ability in the return game especially, but even just to make some big plays. But again, Percy Harvin, he wasn't even interviewed, which is interesting because he had a really close connection with Tim Tebow. And so that was something that maybe was to be desired a little bit in the series, was talking to him. Maybe he denied interviews, maybe he couldn't be reached, whatever the case. Certainly a little bit of a missed opportunity there. But all in all, the second episode, again, focuses on this new chapter that the Gators were in, and how they, things came together in the 06 season. They faced their challenges. They lost the game that season, I believe, to Auburn, but they were able to get the job done against, I remember the 06 BCS National Championship game. They get there by beating Arkansas. A big play that was made, a fumble on a punt, but also Urban Meyer pulling out kind of the trick plays to go for it on fourth down with a fake punt. That was kind of an end around, a sweep play. And that kind of set the tone and changed that game that was starting to slip away and go in the Razorbacks' favor. But they reached the national championship game. They piece everything together. And then I think the way they ended that episode was Urban Meyer saying something along the lines of, he was I think talking to his dad or something like that. Or he talks and he basically says, like, we did it. It's all done. Pressure goes away now. We got the job done. And he was like, the last thing in the episode is something along the lines of, couldn't have been more wrong. And so episode 3, then, what it does is dive into what the pressure brought for the Florida Gators. And if you remember, there's kind of two things that are part of it. First of all, it's just the pressure that comes with being national champions in any sport, but especially college football, where, as they talk about in the doc and as college football fans know, football is king in the Southeastern Conference and in that territory, especially in the Deep South. And so having that pressure made things extraordinarily difficult for the Gators. And another part of it, too, was that Tim Tebow became the star. And that's not to take away from any other players. That's kind of what happened in the media. That's what happened. Some of the other guys were talking about how when they go to parties, everybody would be asking about where's Tebow at, those sort of things, always driving the attention to him. And Tebow obviously put together, one of the best seasons that a sophomore has ever had. He was the first sophomore to win the Heisman Trophy in 2007, but the Gators suffered 3 defeats that year, actually 4 because they lost the bowl game as well, and just kind of were in an in-between period, so to say, and that's when a lot of off-the-field issues started to pile up. Things started going awry a little bit, and then 2008 rolls around. And they have that infamous loss to Ole Miss. I kind of had forgotten about this, and I probably wouldn't have even remembered if I hadn't seen this in the episode, that an extra point was blocked. It was 31-30 with, I think, a few minutes left in the game, and it gets blocked. Ole Miss wins the game, and then Tebow promises, you've never seen a player play as hard as I will. You're never going to see a team play as hard as this team will. And he makes that infamous promise, basically, that the Gators would take home the national championship. And so they do. And from that point on, they really dominated every opponent. They even handled Alabama pretty well in the SEC championship game. And that team was able, against a really high-powered Oklahoma offense. College football fans will remember Sam Bradford. I remember the hype going into that game. You've got back-to-back Heisman Trophy winners going against each other in that game. And the Sooners bring an offense that rivaled the Gators and was probably even more high-powered. But the Gators defense made some big plays. Major Wright set the tone early in that game. He was one of the guys who was interviewed, and he talked about how, he could have gone for the interception. He saw the ball, but he just wanted to hit the guy. And so he hits the Sooners wide receiver, and that set the tone. And they said, kind of instilling that fear in the Sooners offense. And from there, the Gators won. It wasn't a huge margin, but they won fairly comfortably. And so then they established themselves 2 championships in 3 years. But this is where something that I wanted to touch on as it pertains to right now for a certain team in the SEC might want to take a look at and maybe pull kind of from this docuseries even a little bit. And that's the Georgia Bulldogs. They're back-to-back national champions. So similarly, this year they're going for title number 3. And it's not quite the same, obviously, but we've seen in college football how difficult it is to three-peat. Winning 3 times in 4 years is a little bit more doable. But again, a three-peat, I've talked about this in previous video, hasn't happened since the 1930s Minnesota. But what happened with this Florida team is the pressure really started to build and build and build. The focus was on Tebow when other players felt like they were more deserving for some, or at least equally deserving of the coverage, and the focus went to Tebow. And obviously the way that Tebow's character is, he tried to deflect it in some ways, but it simply was impossible to deflect the amount of just focus that went to Tebow. And so what happens then is there's a game against Mississippi State, and throughout this episode, kind of the focus is just on how miserable, like you've never seen a team that's the reigning national champions be this miserable. And so kind of throughout the first half of the game against Mississippi State, Spikes and Tebow are kind of going at each other a little bit, maybe passive aggressively at first, and then they start like actually like being cognizant about it, I guess, and intentionally going at each other. And it created like a split that was resolved enough to win that game and finish the regular season undefeated, but I'm sure just kind of ate away at the team camaraderie, at the togetherness of the team, and caused a very famous loss the day that the Gators died and Tebow cried against Alabama in the 2009 SEC championship game. And Urban Meyer talks about the health issues that he was dealing with, how he was taking Ambien, how he couldn't sleep, and how that was starting to eat away at him. And another thing I didn't really focus on was 2010 season. I think because the way that I see it, this was really especially a focus on the 2006 to 2009 players. And Meyer's tenure, because it focuses on kind of the start of it, and it gives, I guess, an explanation of why it ended the way it did, how he stepped away briefly and then came back to coach 2010 and then was, stepped away for good from the Gators, at least after that season. We know he eventually came back to coach the Ohio State Buckeyes and won a national championship. My takeaway from that is, first of all, I mean, it's cool to see into a little bit of a look at the culture that can happen when you've been on top. I mean, they were on top of the world. College football runs the state of Florida, runs the South. There was even a point where the legal issues that they focused on, talking about how there was an attorney that was specifically hired in Gainesville, in the surrounding area, to kind of make problems go away. And I think that was well done. It was a short focus, but I thought it was really good for them to hone in on that and show that probably we don't know about all the stuff that went on. And sure, some really good investigative reporting, could go into that and dive into what some of those things that were really swept under the rug that maybe never even saw the light of day, what those might have been. But it does kind of drive home the point that, and we see this in sports in general a lot of times, that when you're in these high positions of power, as wrong as it is, a lot of people can get away with a lot of different things. I kind of even saw it in the Johnny Football documentary. If you haven't seen that, on same series, Untold, aired a couple of weeks ago, talking about how he had Johnny Manziel hired a lawyer, basically, or had a lawyer who could, or maybe I think it was his agent, maybe, who kind of functioned almost like a lawyer. He might have had a lawyer too, if I'm remembering correctly, who made a thing like receiving money for autographs kind of go away a little bit, came up with this crazy story that the press believed that, well, maybe it wasn't too crazy, it wasn't maybe too far from the truth, but that his parents were oil, millionaires, and that's where all the money came from. But anyways, I'm shifting gears back. I think two things that they maybe could have done a little bit better. I think they had a good amount of sources, and they had good sources, and they had players and a couple of coaches who were vital to this program, and that was Urban Meyer, and then Dan Mullen was also featured a lot. And so I think they could have maybe benefited from talking to a few other players. I mean, we didn't hear anything from Marquise and Mike Pouncey, the Pouncey brothers who played there kind of during that same time, part of the 2007 recruiting class. We don't hear anything from Percy Harvin, like I mentioned earlier, or, I mean, there are other players on that team. Again, they did a pretty good job of that. I don't think that takes too much away from it. The second thing is kind of brushing away some of the legal stuff that this team was, enraptured in. Cam Newton, another player that was, I think, featured, like I saw him pop up a couple of times in highlights during the series, but not really much on Cam Newton, who was obviously electric, had issues there with, having, forced them to transfer out and go to junior college before going to Auburn. But on the positive side, what I really liked about this series, it's a good look again at that championship culture. And I think a team like the Georgia Bulldogs, it's not like they're probably going to take much from this from this series, but just from the outside looking in, what that pressure can do to a program, and what especially it seems like going for championship number 3. I mean, Alabama did it 2009 and then winning in 2011 and 2012. But going 3 straight years, I mean, that pressure, as much as coaches, can say, they're not going to let the pressure get to us. It finds its way to invade into the team and can definitely cause some clashing of heads and some disagreements and everything inside of a team, like the docuseries showed, especially in episode 4. But it was a really cool look. As somebody who has always been kind of a fan of the Gators, I'd say they're a second team from my time. Actually, my family and I lived in Orlando during those championship years, interestingly enough. I think somewhere like 2006 to 2009. So kind of crazy. I think that's kind of cool because we didn't actually go to any games at Ben Hill Griffin Stadium, but definitely watch the Gators pretty much every week. Tim Tebow has and continues to be, as a Christian, as a believer, he's somebody that I look up to. He's somebody that I continue to hope to be like. He's somebody that, because of how I looked up to him as a role model, I was really excited for this series. And it was a cool look. I really enjoyed this series. It was a pretty quick watch. Spent some time watching it today on Tuesday when it released. But overall, some things that could have been focused on that weren't really focused on. I know a lot of people going into this expected it to be like this explosive thing. Like I saw a comparison to ESPN's 30 for 30 on the U, on Miami's football teams of like the late 90s, early 2000s when they were running college football. But yeah, I think another takeaway is kind of the realization of how Florida really set the tone for the SEC's, two now decades of dominance. You had the LSU title in 2003, but definitely 2006 was the first that like the SEC really set the tone. And then 2007 you have LSU again, and then Florida 2008, Alabama 2009, and then Auburn 2010, and then Alabama. So you have what is that? 7 years straight where the SEC won every single title, and even since then they've continued to do the same. So I think that Florida Gators team kind of changed the standard, really, also because another thing they talked about in this was how defense really was what defined the SEC in a lot of ways, but Florida brought this spread offense that Urban Meyer had really, I would say, almost perfected, maybe even perfected out at Utah. He brings it to Florida, and that kind of started a transition. Alabama definitely went with a lot of defenses and more, ground and pound, run the ball, but it kind of started, I think, that transition into more of a passing game and being able to win championships. Obviously, Oregon brought it to a point where that you could at least reach a championship with a lot of passing, but the SEC, Florida, I think, started that transition by showing that you could win championships doing that. But all in all, Swamp Kings was a solid watch. Definitely, again, left some things to be desired, but it was definitely really cool to get a look into the Florida Gators of 2006 and 2009. If I had to give the series a rating, I guess we'll go 1 to 5. It always seems like a little bit of a cop-out answer, but I would give it a 4. I think it was really cool to get, again, a look into what that culture looked like. Again, mainly for the football team. Wasn't too much as much of a focus. There were a lot of like comments about like, we were out partying, we were doing these things, we were getting in trouble. It didn't really it was mostly on the football field. It was what the focus was on, and a little bit on like what went into being as dominant as they were. It did leave a little bit to be desired. Maybe some people who could have been featured that weren't in terms of interviews. Paul Feinbaum also featured a lot, and a Gainesville journalist, I think Dan Cooley. I might be wrong on that name. I'll need to clarify that. But all in all, good, 4 out of 5. I'd maybe push it up to 4.5. That might be a little bit of the bias kicking in. But all in all, Swamp Kings was a really, really cool look into the Florida Gators of 2005 to 2009, really. But that's my thoughts on Swamp Kings. If you've enjoyed this kind of review and maybe want to see more, maybe I could break down Johnny Football one a little bit. But if you've enjoyed this video, please feel free to leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this. And that's it for this episode of College Football Talk. I'm Peter Burtnett, signing out. Peace.